My name is Paul Wolver. I'm the owner of Pinellas Power Products, and this is the installation instruction video for generators that use the Johnson Group 149cc engine. That would include the WEN 3600 and some others. For the purpose of this video, I will be installing this kit on a WEN 3600. If you happen to have another brand of generator that uses the Johnson 149cc engine, the instructions will be the same. Real quickly, a lot of people will ask me, can I still use the generator as stock? The answer is absolutely yes. You can use the stock tank. You can run it without my remote tank or anything like that. The next thing I'd like to get ahead of here is, if you need to contact me, please contact me through my website. If you're looking at this on YouTube, if you look in the description section, you'll see that there's a link to my website which has my phone number and my email address. Please do not attempt to contact me through YouTube. I do not monitor the YouTube chat or any of the chat groups or anything like that. Okay, this is the kit. First thing it has is a quick flyer explaining that you bought the greatest thing since sliced bread. In the kit is a bag of small parts. The most important item in the small parts is a flash drive with a copy of the video that you're watching right now. So you'll use this flash drive to install the kit from. And let's go ahead and get started. The first step will be to pull this side cover off. There is a small screw below and to the right of the fuel selector valve. There's also a screw right in the center of the fuel selector valve. And then there are two upper captive screws. These screws will not come all the way out of the case. They're actually held into the case by an E-clip. Do is we'll pull out on a recoil rope and leave just enough slack to leave this hanging, and that way it's out of the way. Then if you come around to the other side, there's a spark plug access door that you push in on with your thumb and pops right out. And then this side cover has two thumb screws that you turn and it comes right out. Then for the installation of the kit, the first thing we're going to do is remove the breather hose. And that's got two Corbin clamps. To undo a Corbin clamp, you simply squeeze on the two tabs and slide it back out of the way. And I'll show you in a lot greater detail once I get this out of here. Okay, a Corbin clamp has two ears on it. And you simply squeeze on those two ears and the clamp gets bigger. When you release, the clamp gets tighter. Do not dispose of this hose. You will be using it later. Now we're going to go ahead and undo the spark plug cap. And put that out of the way. Then we're going to undo the plastic cover that goes over the valve cover. Do not forget to put this plastic cover back on. I have seen people install my kits and the explanation was, yes, but it's hard to put on, but it's also important because that's part of the air ducting that keeps the high pressure air around the cylinder fins to cool it. The plastic cover is held on by a single bolt. You'll just lift the plastic cover out of the way. The valve cover itself is held on by 4 bolts with 8mm heads. These bolts have the same exact head as the bolt that had the plastic cover, however, they're longer. what we're going to do is we're going to disable the stock PCV valve so that you will have a pressure and vacuum going to the fuel pump. Let me get a magnet and recover that screw real quickly. The screw fell all the way down into here, which is a little bit too far for the magnet. So I'm going to go ahead and pull the back cover off. Incidentally, this back cover has to come off later on in the install process, so it's not like it's a big issue. But the best time to get anything if you drop it is immediately after you dropped it. That way you don't forget and go, where on earth did this piece go to? And there's our screw. So now we're back to good. Okay, so now we're going to take the valve cover and we're going to disable the stock PCV valve. And the way we do that is there are 4 Phillips head screws holding the breather plate in place. So we're going to remove these 4 Phillips head screws. Okay. So this is a breather plate here. And underneath this cover is a round hole in this plate, and it's covered by a reed valve. And the reed valve is this real thin piece of steel right here. So what we're going to do is we're going to take a zip tie, and as you can see, right by my fingernail is the reed valve itself. We're going to zip tie the reed valve to the reed stop. Whatever you do, make sure that you get the reed valve and the reed stop. I had one generator in here that the customer did his install and simply put the zip tie around the reed stop only, and the reed valve was totally closed. So we've taken the zip tie and pulled it real tight around the reed stop and the reed itself, and now we're going to cut the tail off. Can you see that good? This little wafer, a real thin piece of steel, is the reed valve itself, and we're just simply zip tying it open. So when you get the reed valve zip tied in the open position, you can now put the breather plate back in place. Incidentally, do not put gasket sealant on the breather plate when it goes in here. There is a gasket. However, this little notch is an oil return, and if you put gasket sealant on it and you get this little notch filled in with gasket sealer, the fuel pump won't work. You're going to pump all the oil out of the end. It's just going to really ruin your day. So don't put gasket sealant on this gasket. You'll notice there was none on it from the factory. So now we're going to put the original 4 screws that held the breather plate in place. We're going to put all 4 screws in loose before we go tightening any of them down. Now, this is a valve cover gasket. Unfortunately, we did not damage the valve cover gasket at all when we were pulling it apart because it's a brand new engine. The kit comes with a replacement valve cover gasket. And yes, the kits come with a Yamaha valve cover gasket because I can get them reliably from Yamaha. And as you can clearly see, the Yamaha valve cover gasket fits perfectly because this is a copy of a Yamaha engine. Okay, so now we're going to put the valve cover back on, right where it came off. We'll be using the original bolts that held it on, and these are the 4 long ones as opposed to the short bolt. We're going to start all 4 of them first before we go tightening any of them down. Then we will put the plastic cover back in place, and that goes on just the opposite of the way we took it off. And that'll be held on by the single shorter bolt. Okay. Now there's a little clip held on by a screw that holds the front ignition coil on. You may have to loosen up that screw to get this clip angled just right. But what we're going to do is slide the float bowl vent tube off of that barb where it was in the carburetor so that we can run the spark plug wire right up through here like this. And you'll see why when we go to put the fuel pump on, that this creates just a little bit more room in an area that was pretty crowded before. And it's still crowded, but this just creates just a little bit more room. Okay, so now with the spark plug wire behind the float bowl vent tube, and now we can take this wire clip and just put it in place just a little bit here. We don't want it too tight. Okay. The next step is going to be to remove the fuel line from the carburetor. And this is a fuel line that goes from the fuel selector valve to the carburetor. If you come over to this side of the generator, you'll be able to see it a little better. This hose right here goes from the fuel selector valve across to the other side, right here, and it goes on to a barb on the carburetor. It passes through a groove right here. You can see where there's a groove in the back of the inverter housing that fuel hose goes through. Okay. The fuel hose is clamped in place by a Corbett clamp And we're going to remove the Corbin clamp. And then we're going to remove the hose. Now, incidentally, this Corbin clamp may have the two tabs pointed down or up or whatever. Simply spin them around to where they're at the top so that you can get on it with a pair of needle nose pliers to pull it out. Once we get this out, we will not be reusing this clamp. So let's set that aside. This is the replacement PCV valve, and it's included in the kit. The PCV valve is going to come fully assembled with the tie wraps on these connections here. You'll take the replacement PCV valve and slide it onto the port on the valve cover where this hose came off of. And you're going to push it all the way back into place. Then included in the kit there are two size hose clamps. There are two of the smaller hose clamps, and I'll point out where you use the smaller hose clamp. You only use it in one location, but I'm including two clamps in the kit just in case you lose one. There are several of the larger hose clamps included in the kit. You can either put a large hose clamp on here, which will be a fight to get it on. I don't recommend it. The reason why I have the hose clamps in here is because they're reusable. So if you were to squeeze down on the hose clamp and it would be engaged, if you wanted to undo it, you would twist sideways and it could be reused. You'll also get several zip ties included in the kit. The zip ties are a one-shot deal. So if you use them one time, that's it. You have to cut it to get it off and put a new zip tie on. However, because this area is so tight here, I recommend you use the zip tie. What you'll do is put the zip tie around the hose and slide it up against the valve cover as close as you can get it onto that barb. And then we'll go ahead and cut the tail off the zip tie. Included in the kit is a fuel pump. Now the fuel pump is going to have 3 ports on it. The fuel ports, which will be this one, will have a plastic cover on it. That's fuel in. This one is fuel out, and it'll also have a plastic cover on it. You'll slide those off. If you leave the plastic covers on, the fuel pump won't work. This port here is a pulse port, and that hooks to the new breather hose that we just put in place. Right here. So you'll slide that onto this port of the fuel pump and just lay the fuel pump loosely in this area. Now, the kit comes with several feet of 1/4-inch fuel line. I have already cut the fuel line to the appropriate lengths. So in the bag of small parts is a 1/4-inch T-fitting. First thing you'll do is take a 3-inch section of the hose that you've cut off and put it onto one of the side ports of the T-fitting. A little bit of oil on the T-fitting makes it a lot easier. If you don't have a little cap full of oil, just take the dipstick out of the generator and just drop a little bit of oil onto the T-fitting. That'll make your life so much easier. Now, put the other end of the 3-inch hose onto the fuel inlet port of the fuel pump. So this was the pulse port. This will be the fuel inlet port. And that slides on like so. Then, this is the hose that we just removed from the carburetor. The one that had this Corbin clamp on it. So we're going to take this hose and slide it onto this, or the base fitting of the T. And here's where these small hose clamps come in. You'll get 2 of the smaller size hose clamps. This is the only location where you'll use it. You got 2 of them just in case you lose one or whatever. And that goes on this stock hose where it goes on the T fitting. Because the stock hose is a thinner sidewall, so it requires a smaller hose clamp. Now you'll notice that the hose is pointing up into the T-fitting here. Instead of the T-fitting pointing directly sideways, the T-fitting kind of points down at an angle. Now, take the original breather hose, and that's what used to go from the port on the valve cover to this little fitting on the intake manifold. You'll remove the 2 Corbin clamps from the hose, remove the protective sleeve from the hose, and put the short end of the hose right back onto the fitting on the intake manifold where it came off of. Then you'll mark where this hose needs to be cut. So you'll mark it with your thumbnail. Cut the hose, shortened like this. Put it back onto the manifold, and the other end goes over the PCV valve. So now, instead of the hose running from the valve cover to the manifold, you've got a pulse port which powers the fuel pump. Now you take the section of hose that you cut to 28 inches earlier. Since you've already got this clamp loosened up and just loosely fitting in there, slide this hose right behind the float bowl vent hose, and then you can fold that clamp back down because it'll hold everything in place. This hose now goes on to the output port on the fuel pump. We're going to take this hose, feed it behind the float bowl vent, so it runs around in a nice smooth radius. This end of the hose is going to go back onto the carburetor port that we removed that thin wall hose from earlier. So we'll take a pair of needle nose pliers, and I'm going to fold the fuel pump out of the way just a little bit so I can get a better position on this. I don't know if that helps or hurts. Okay, so I'm going to take this and I'm going to slide it onto the port on the back of the carburetor. I'm going to shove my fingers back in there so I can feel it going in place. And you want to make sure and push it all the way on to the barb, all the way to the casting, the same as you did with the valve cover. because that barb is only about 13 millimeters long. And once again, space is very limited. So you can either put a hose clamp, and there's enough included in the kit to do that, or because it is such a tight fit, again, I recommend using one of the zip ties that's included in the kit. And like I said before, you will have plenty of them. If you use a zip tie, enter it from this direction with the clasp here and come around, and you'll see why when you go to pull tension on it. But I'm going to pull it to about here so that now I have the tail that I can grab a hold of with a pair of pliers to put tension on it once I get it all the way in place. If you do accidentally get the clamp in the wrong spot, you can cut it off and get a fresh one and do it over, because the kit comes with lots of these zip ties. So if you do make a slight mistake, it's not the end of the world, and you'd cut the tail off. I don't know if you can see that clearly with the camera or not, but if you come over here and look in, you can see this hose going onto the port of the carburetor, and you can see that I did not clip that tail very tightly at all. Let me give it another shot. Now I did. Much better. So now this hose comes out of the output port of the fuel pump, runs around the air filter through this groove, back up and into the carburetor. And you want to make sure that all the hoses are nice and smooth bends. You don't want any sharp kinks. I'm going to use another zip tie just to zip tie this hose to this loop on the intake manifold. And this is not for anything critical. This just makes it easier to put the cover on with these hoses held reasonably in place. When you're done, you want to make sure that the float bowl vent hose and the float bowl drain hose come out through the bottom of the car, or the bottom of the generator housing. The larger one is the vent, the smaller one is the fuel drain. Okay. The fuel pump will tuck into this area right here. Do not run a screw into any of these holes. The fuel pump will be suspended by the fuel hoses. If you run a screw into it, you run a great likelihood of ruining the inverter module, which you'll see is directly behind this panel. If you go through this panel or drill a hole in it, you could easily ruin the inverter module, so I strongly don't recommend you doing that. The next item will be to take the remaining hose and just take the whole thing. You'll shorten it to length later. Feed it in through the spark plug access door in the top and onto the third and final port of the T-fitting right here. Now we will get ourselves a handful of hose clamps. might as well start here. And these are all going to be the larger sized hose clamps, because these are all going on the thick-walled tubing that comes in my kit as opposed to the thin-wall stock hose. And everywhere there's a connection, put a hose clamp. Or should I say, there's everywhere that there's a connection that you have not already put a zip tie. Let me show you something real quickly if I haven't already showed you. But when you go to squeeze these clamps together, if they're a little bit crooked like this, a little bit crooked like that, take the pair of pliers, squeeze like this, and get them straight. Or if you need to undo one, simply twist sideways. This clamp here, I'm going to put with the clasp portion facing away from me. That way it'll put a little bit more clearance here for the cover. And keep in mind, this hose carries air, not gasoline. Okay, this is going to be the hose that takes fuel from the remote tank and puts it into the generator. There are two ways that this can be done. Number one is you can clip the hose right here and put the quick disconnect fitting here and just tuck it inside the spark plug cap. That would be the easy way to do it. Or tuck it inside the spark plug cover. That would be the easy way to do it. However, we're going to do it the more difficult way because I want to show how to do it the more difficult way. Basically, you would take and put the PVC thread tape on the male threads, screw this together, and cut this hose and put this fitting on it and just tuck it down inside here, and it would be stored here. You'd take that cover off and pop it up and snap your fuel hose to it when you wanted to use it. Unless you'd like a more permanent mount, which is what we'll be doing here. Incidentally, if you mounted, or excuse me, if you just tucked the fitting in here, you'd have a very short area to put in a fuel filter, and I don't like that. So where we're going to mount it, number one, it's permanently mounted, and number two, you have more room to mount a fuel filter. So that's a couple of reasons why I like this method better. After looking at the video that we just shot, I realized that I need to demonstrate the easy method of installing the fuel inlet port, as well as the most difficult version. So the simple method, as I explained quickly, is you simply take the input hose from the T and route it up out of the spark plug cover area. So what we're going to do is take the Teflon tape that's included in the kit, and we will wrap the threads of the fuel port the same way that we did on the more difficult version. And you will remember to wrap the tape around the threads right up to the edge, but do not overlap like this, because if you overlap it like this, when you screw the hose barb on, it will shear off that piece. So now we will take the hose barb and screw it onto the fuel port. And then we will feed this hose up through the spark plug access area. We'll slide the hose onto the hose barb, and then we'll put one of the clamps around it. Now, when you're not using the remote tank, you can simply take this and tuck it down inside the spark plug port or the spark plug access port area. Then, when you take and you put the lid on it, it's all concealed within the generator. Or if you take the lid off, you can take the port, extend it up through here, and snap your fuel hose onto it, and I'll demonstrate that in the demo movie. At any rate, the pins should always be facing forward because you want the fuel hose to come across the front of the generator and plug in. You do not want a fuel hose to be coming up the back of the generator where the gasoline, or excuse me, up the back of the generator where the hot exhaust is blowing on a fuel hose. And now we'll go ahead and demonstrate how to install the more difficult method, and that way you can choose which way you would like. As I stated earlier, the simple method does not allow you enough room to put the fuel filter in this. So you'd actually have to cut the prime bulb hose and put the fuel filter in the prime bulb hose if you wanted to put a fuel filter in it. If you simply did not care for the fuel filter and you wanted the easiest install method, this would be it. So now we'll go ahead and do the more difficult method. If you come around the back, and you saw earlier where we removed this panel when we dropped the valve cover bolt, we have to remove it anyway. What you'll do is take two fingers and stick them behind this area here to feel the opening. And what we want to do is set the hole so that it sets just far enough above this body line that, okay, so the bottom hole, the bottom dot will be it. Just far enough of this, above this body line that we will be able to screw the fitting in from the top, but down far enough so that when you feel in here, there's a fuel tank just to the right, an evaporative emissions container forward, and the plastic shroud around the muffler is below it. So we're going to drill the hole right about here. And it's going to be just big enough for these threads to go into. I'm going to use a step drill. You can use either a regular drill bit or a step drill, whichever way you feel the most comfortable with. And I will be drilling it out to where it's fairly close to the finished size, and then I will be finishing it up with a repairman's reamer so that we get a precise fit. This is a repairman's reamer. It will allow me to ream this hole out a little bit at a time instead of drilling too big a hole. Okay. Nice tight fit. Okay. Next, you want to take a roll of Teflon tape that's included in the kit, and you'll wrap it around the threads to the fuel fitting. you want it to come up to the end of the threads, but do not overlap. Like, don't do that, because then it'll tear off that little piece. Truth be known, that piece will get caught in the filter, so it won't do any damage. However, that'll clog up the filter prematurely. So then, take the washer included in the kit, put the washer over the fuel fitting, with the radius or the bend of the washer matching up to the radius on the outside of the housing. Then comes the trickiest part, and that's getting these threads started. Be aware that when this is done, we want the pins facing forward, because we want the fuel hose to snap on from this direction, because we do not want the fuel hose to be coming up the back and get hot exhaust gases on that fuel line at all. Okay, so now our fitting is pinched down over the washer and over the housing for the generator. So what I'm going to do is cut this hose approximately right here. That way I'll have a long tail in both directions that I can make adjustments from. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to put this end onto the hose bar and sneak up in there and put a hose clamp on it. Just getting a little bit of oil on my finger so I can put that on the hose bar so I can get this hose on more easily. Okay, so now we've got the hose all the way up against the hose barb. Now we have our hose clamp in place. So what we're going to do now is come over to this side. Now let's go ahead and put the fuel filter in. You'll notice that the fuel filter has arrows, and they indicate the direction of fuel flow, which will be from the fuel inlet port that's connected to the remote tank into the fuel pump. So the first thing I'm going to do is connect the input side of the filter to the hose that we just installed from the fuel inlet port. Like so. And then we will take the hose that goes to the fuel pump, route it where it needs to go, and trim it to where it is just slightly longer than what it appears it needs to be. The reason we're going to trim it slightly longer is because if it is too long, we can always shorten it if we have to, or have just a little bit of extra hose in there, which is not going to hurt anything. So now the fuel filter will sit up here. We'll go ahead and put our hose clamps on it. Okay, so now the fuel filter is in place. And now it's time to just do some tidying up. Item number one, you'll notice that there is an aluminum insert threaded right here that is not used in this particular version of the generator. So I'm going to take one of the extra zip ties and I'm going to feed it through this little threaded aluminum insert. And wrap it around and zip tie the fuel inlet hose to the housing. And this is not a critical step. It's just going to make the cover a little easier to put on and off when you go to open it up, check the air filter, check the oil level, check the fuel filter, and things like that. It's nice that the fuel pump will not be popping out of place. And then just look over it and make sure that all the hoses are in smooth radiused bends. It's like this hose here, instead of running it straight from the output of the pump directly into the carburetor, that would have required a fairly sharp bend here. So that's the only reason why it loops all the way around the air filter and back up, so that they're nice smooth bends. Next thing you'll notice is that this hose that goes from the inlet of the carburetor to the PCV valve, we have not put the hose clamps back on it. So let's do that right now. And that's the one that used the somewhat mediocre quality OEM wire hose clamps. They're not real good, but they're hose clamps. And the manufacturer felt that they were necessary, so let's go ahead and put those back on. If you prefer to use zip ties, then by all means use it. Or if you prefer to use the clamps that are included in my kit, go ahead and do that. I'm going to go ahead and put the wire clamps that the manufacturer had on there. They're not that good. However, keep in mind that they go between the PCV valve and the carburetor inlet, which is not a pressurized area, and because the PCV valve stops any air flowing in this direction, the vacuum that's drawn from the crankcases will not draw air through here. So it's not a critical area, but we'll just go ahead and tidy that up. And if you see anything else that needs to be tidied up, then you go ahead and do that at this time. This hose that runs from the fuel selector valve to this T-fitting is in the original factory groove. The float bowl vent tube and the float bowl drain tube are coming through the appropriate holes in the bottom of the generator, so they're in the right spot. So now we can go ahead and start putting our covers back on. So the rear cover, these two little tabs slide up, and then you put the 6 screws in. Come around this side, make sure nothing's pinched or in the wrong spot. There are 3 tabs at the bottom that you hook into 3 holes at the bottom, and 2 snaps, one on the front, one on the rear. Then you'll tighten the 2 captive screws. Then put the fuel selector valve knob in place. Remember, the line was pointing to the engine off position. Then we have the remaining screw, which goes just below and to the right of the fuel selector knob. And on this side of the generator, put this cover on. Again, there are 3 tabs, and they go into the 3 slots at the bottom. The spark plug cover. Then there's a decal with the operating instructions. Put the decal on the side of the generator wherever you want. I'm going to put it right here next to the fuel selector valve because that's the most important point. And I will mention that step 7 is not a misprint. The most common question I get with these is usually answered by, do you have the fuel selector valve in the off position? And they go, no, I thought that was a misprint. Nope, not a misprint. Okay, the last 2 items in the kit are a fuel hose, and this is 3 meters long, or 9.5 feet if your brain works in American, and another quick disconnect. This quick disconnect will screw into the remote tank, and this hose will connect the 2. Make sure that the arrow on this prime bulb is pointing in the direction of fuel flow, which would be from the fuel tank to the generator. Once again, if you have any questions whatsoever about this kit, do not hesitate to call me. If you look in the description section below this video, if you're on YouTube, you'll find contacts for how to get a hold of me at my website. It's got my email address and my phone number. And once again, please do not attempt to contact me through YouTube. I do not monitor YouTube comments or feedback, and I do not monitor any of the chat groups. So if you get a hold of me by phone or by email, you'll get a quick response. I thank you for your time.